All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at it again with another section on key unit vocabulary. This time we're taking a look at the so-called Gothic turn in American literature, dealing roughly with the period from late to mid 1840s to about the beginning of the American Civil War. It's a relatively short period of American literature, but it's also the most important period that we have in terms of the authors we're going to deal with. Now, Emerson, as I mentioned in Transcendentalism, is the most important American author. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the next 100 years of American literature after Emerson is really all just a response to Emerson. Basically, everything we have from the time that Emerson publishes Nature to the end of the Second World War is just a continuous response to Emerson. I think this is the case. That being said, most of the major canonical American authors that we think of when we think of American literature, this would be Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, so on and so forth. They come from this period of what's called the Gothic in American literature, or sometimes called dark romanticism. And what we're going to see is these authors, yes, they take a darker turn. Yes, they look at the less optimistic, more sinister sides of human nature and also the external nature in response to Emerson, and we're going to be discussing that a lot. All those things are definitely true. But what's really interesting for us about the Gothic authors is that in spite of the fact that they cover this really short period of time, they produce a lot of literature that we remember, and they produce a response to Emerson that I think is really, I don't know what the word would be, but is really quite impressive. It's a criticism of Emersonian optimism that we see within the Gothic. And so what's important to understand right from the get-go is that this is not random. Like all trends in intellectual history, like all aesthetic trends and tendencies, if you will, it comes out of somewhere. It doesn't emerge from a vacuum. And this Gothic turn, this focus on horror, on the unconscious, on the aspects of human experience that cannot be reconciled with reason, on things like murder, on the macabre, so on and so forth, this emerges precisely as a response to what is seen to be the excessive optimism of the Emersonian point of view, both in the context of increasing tensions within America, regional divisions, North and South, leading up to the Civil War, world events happening more broadly. You could think 1848 being a huge point of inflection for the development of the Gothic aesthetic in America, but also in relation to America's relationship to its European past. There becomes a sense that from Emersonianism, from the absolute sovereignty of the individual and the individual's freedom from tradition, there is a point of no return. We have gone as far as we possibly can into the project of individualism and liberation from hierarchy, from traditional power structures, from traditional religion, so on and so forth. And that, what would you say, process of revolution cannot continue. That if it were to continue any further, it would be detrimental in some way. And so what we see in the Gothic is really quite a conservative response to the American idea. Not a total rejection of that American idea, but what I would argue that you see in Hawthorne, in Poe, and in Melville most particularly, is a walking back of the American project. A love of America, a deep passion for America, the American people, American culture, but a desire to say Emerson is looking over the precipice. And if we continue with the Emersonian project, we are going to be thrown over the precipice. And so we must walk that back. And what has developed is really quite a conservative literary genre, which is the Gothic. And I would say the Gothic has always been quite conservative, both in the British context and in the American context. And from the Gothic, we of course get horror, the aesthetic of horror, horror films, your slashers, so on and so forth. Which also, interestingly enough, the point has been made by many literary critics, in particular by one very, very good Roman Catholic literary critic who wrote a book called Monsters from the Id. He actually makes the case that, no, horror, in spite of the fact that on the surface it seems like a very, what would you say, anti-traditional, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, anti-religious genre that obsesses over gore and all these unsavory aspects of the human experience, actually represents instead one of the greatest bastions of social conservatism that we see in the contemporary world. And I would argue that this has roots going back to the failure of the projects of the 1840s. But we're going to see how this plays out when we look at some of the key terms and the key ideas that are being used in the Gothic aesthetic. And with no further ado, we're going to dive right into it. I picked fittingly the sort of October in America, fall, cozy aesthetic of a pumpkin patch. There's really nothing more American that doesn't exist in any other part of the world. And we're going to start this part one by talking about the historical and literary context for the Gothic. Let's go here. So the Gothic as an aesthetic goes back to the 18th century, where we start to see the emergence of, one, the novel in the British context, but also the emergence of a specific type of novel that is borrowing elements from the novels that are popular, the sentimental novels. You could think of like Pamela as being a great example of this. It borrows some aspects of, excuse me, the British sentimental novel, but brings in new traits and aspects that develop a new literary genre that has never been before seen. And this is quite interesting if you think about it, because I'll bring in an interesting story in this regard. Horror is constructed. Horror is not something that always exists. In fact, if you read the corpus of medieval literature, study a good amount of it, you'll see that there's no concept of horror. There are strange, fantastical happenings. You could look at the fairy world, episodes of abductions by fairies that happen in medieval romances. There are strange things that happen. There are monsters, but Grendel's Grendel's mother or Grendel, they're not horrifying. They're a demonic presence. They're scary. But what you see in a text like Beowulf, for example, early medieval text, is not quite at the level of modern horror. The focus is not on generating fear in the spectator, the person listening to the poem, the listener, the reader, so on and so forth, nor is it on the sort of exaggerated emotional impact that these scary circumstances have. Nor is there a sort of haunty, eerie, foreboding atmosphere, no focus on melancholia, no focus on sort of darkness. It's just a monster that has to be fought. It's very medieval in that regard. And so the question is, well, where does this idea of horror come from? Why is it all of a sudden in the 18th century that people become interested in horror? And it's not just people, it's in particular British people. And this is an interesting point. There's a literary critic. He's somewhat of a meme in the Spanish-speaking world, but I think his work is fantastic. I would highly recommend him if you speak Spanish. His name is Jesus G. Maestro. Jesus G. Maestro. He's from Spain. And he makes an interesting point in this regard where he says, look, the Gothic novel enters Spain very, 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 very late. We do not see Spanish Gothic novels until the end of the 19th century, and even then they don't really take off. And horror in Spain is not quite the same thing as horror in the rest of the world. And he says basically the idea of horror is a very Anglo-Saxon WASP thing. It develops and it has its sort of, what do you want to say, its hotbed in the Anglo-Saxon world, starting with Britain, later America. And you see elements of this in other Protestant cultures like Germany, but it doesn't take off in the Catholic world, for example, France, or most particularly in Spain, the way that it takes off in Britain. Now, his argument for this is that very somewhat ethno-chauvinistic, you could say. It's just that the Spaniards, they focus much more on romance, chivalry, courage. You can see this in the Quixote. You can see this in El Cantar de mi Cid. They focus more on the knightly chivalric culture. They've always had that has never fully left Spain. And he says that left England, and English people are cowards, and so on and so forth. There may be an element of truth to that, but I think that's highly exaggerated. What I think ends up happening is, if we look at the Gothic as an aesthetic, Gothic is not the same thing as horror. So, for example, Alien is a horror movie, but Alien does not have Gothic elements. The Shining is a horror movie, but The Shining does not have Gothic elements. Whereas, if we look at a 19th century novel like Great Expectations, the scenes in Miss Havisham's estate, Saddest House, I believe it's called, the scenes that take place in Saddest House have a Gothic aesthetic. That's not a horror novel. It's not meant to be horrifying per se, but it evokes elements of the Gothic. And we go, okay, well, what are we talking about when we talk about the Gothic? We are talking about an atmosphere of grimness, of darkness, a focus on death, a focus on abandonment, a focus on the weight of history, and I would say the last two elements are the idea of what's called the return of the repressed, which we're going to talk about in a moment, return of the repressed, and elements of the medieval Catholic past. All the Gothic novels have some element of this. So, for example, if you look at The Monk, one of the earliest Gothic novels that we have, or The Castle of Otranto, they are both evoking medievalism. Well, I think I have that later on. They're both evoking medievalism. a world which is now lost to England. And you go, okay, well, why would that be? Because if we think about things that are scary, why should it be the case that a castle is assumed to be scary? A castle that nobody lives in anymore. A castle that no one lives in anymore is scary. An abandoned house is scary, but an abandoned house is not scary the way an abandoned castle is scary. Other things that are abandoned are not scary at all and don't have any element of the Gothic. Like if we imagined an abandoned cafeteria, no one would think that was scary. If you imagined an abandoned refrigerator, no one would think that was scary. You imagine an abandoned porta potty, no one is going to think that's scary. So why is it that an abandoned castle or an abandoned monastery evoke this atmosphere of horror, dread, the Gothic, but other things that are abandoned don't, right? Like an abandoned, I don't know, Korean strip mall would not evoke the same feeling as an abandoned monastery. Well, why is that? Well, in the English-speaking context, one of the interesting ideas that has been discussed here is that the emergence of the Gothic has a lot to do with the Protestant Reformation and the way it proceeded in England. As I think you know, in the time of Edward VI, the property of the monasteries were seized. Many of the monks were killed. Many of the nuns were raped or violated in some way or killed as well. And it was a very violent takeover of a lot of the church property. That church property later becomes landed estates that are given to new members of the gentry, which, if you think about it, it's kind of like, hey, good news, you have a new house. Bad news, someone got murdered in that house. Someone was raped in that house. You go, okay, well, that clearly carries the weight of history. And so the argument that goes from this is that some of the gentry who inherited those property began to feel that they had inherited some sort of curse, bad luck, or that the property was haunted in some way. Well, why? Because the property carries the weight of history. So again, the property carries the weight of history. These horrific things happened in it, and it reminds the person who lives there of, one, England used to be a Catholic country. England's been a Catholic country longer than it's been a Protestant country. Two, here are all of the elements of the past you want to forget about. The medieval worldview, the Catholic worldview, merry old England, like all these different concepts that, oh, we're too advanced for that now. You repress that. You try to forget about that. And three, it's a constant reminder of horror, of trauma, and of suffering. Because any place where we feel the weight of history can be a haunted place. A porta potty does not have the weight of history. But like an abandoned orphanage does have the weight of history. And so an abandoned orphanage is not Gothic, I would say, because it lacks that medieval element. But it could be haunted. It could be scary. An abandoned school, especially if something like traumatic happened at that school, you could think of like True Detective. That evokes horror, but that's not quite the Gothic. The Gothic requires that medieval element. But what you notice common to all of these different trends, whether we're talking about Gothic novels in the American or the British context, or we're talking about horror, is the weight of history is evoked. And that's due to a concept that we call the return of the repressed. And so what is happening in horror? Well, what happens is we want to forget about something. And anytime we try to forget about a truth, or forget about a reality, or ignore something, it always comes back in a more psychologically distressing form. Which is, of course, the idea is that the psychologically healthy person just accepts reality, tries to adopt themselves to reality in some important or meaningful way. Well, if you can't do that, and you just say, I'm going to ignore reality, I'm going to ignore the things that I see before me, those get pushed down into the unconscious, the part of the mind where you're not aware of them. But eventually, the sort of psychic pressure is going to break, and they're going to come back up. And this is true of individuals, as well as being true of entire societies. And so we can look at a couple interesting examples of this. I think it's easier if we talk about contemporary horror films first. One of my favorite horror films, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I'm talking about the original. I did not want to watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre when it was first recommended to me because, gory, bloody, it just sounds stupid. And then I watched it and I was transfixed. And I realized it actually goes much deeper. Because the story of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the story of however many hippies going through Texas on their way to like a degenerate, drug-filled orgy. They're going to go do like degenerate hippie things. Age of Aquarius, we are beyond tradition. We are beyond the sort of the limits of American social conservatism. We are not like our parents. We're going to do something new and interesting. Well, what happens to them? They, through a series of unfortunate events, you could say, come into contact with the thing they wanted to forget about. Oh, we're new, we're sexually liberated, we're feminist, we're progressive, we have all these new ideas, we're going to bring about this glorious society, blah, 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 blah. What did they repress? The WASP family. For better or for worse, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant family, living in the countryside, mom and pop type stuff. And they repress that. Oh, wait, the standard American family, we just do not think about it, ignore it, this, that, the other. What comes back to kill them? The rural, standard, working class American family comes back in a psychologically distressing form to punish them. It's return of the repressed. The very thing that everyone wanted to forget about comes back. Another example of this, I will get the details wrong of it, but the principle is right. Ridley Scott's Alien comes out very shortly after or just around the time of Roe v. Wade. There is a national conversation happening about abortion during this time period. Okay, everybody knows the scene in Alien where the alien just pops out, right? Well, why is that so terrifying? Where does that come from? What sort of fear is being dealt with? Well, it's the same thing of Return of the Repressed. Everybody wants to put this down and say, no, we've moved beyond this. We don't need to treat this as a human life, so on and so forth. Now, I, as a Catholic, of course, I'm going to tell you, I very much do believe it's a human life. And I think the proof that people unconsciously know about this is the very fact that what happens when you watch Alien? Why was this so distressing to so many people? It is as if this fetus-like creature comes back to destroy the mother. The very thing that everyone wanted to forget about. The existence of human life, certain social norms that protect the unborn children, so on and so forth. Those things come back to destroy and punish the mother. If you see Scream, they talk about the rules of scary movies. Well, the rules of scary movies are if you take drugs or you engage in sexual intercourse, you're going to die. Well, why would that be? Well, that's part of the moral conservatism of the world of horror. Is that the things you want to forget about, oh, it's fine, victimless crime, we're just here to have fun, this, that, the other, comes back. Another great example. You can tell I'm a horror movie fan. I Know What You Did Last Summer. Classic horror movie. How does it open? We're on the beach, we're having an orgy, we're smoking weed, we're drinking, we're doing all these things we shouldn't be doing, and then, drunk driving, we hit someone, we're just going to forget about it. No problem. Victimless crime, having fun is not bad. There's nothing wrong with having fun. There's nothing wrong with a little marijuana, little beach party, a little sex, this, that, the other. Repress all of those things. What happens? The thing that is repressed comes back to kill you, which is the plot of I Know What You Did Last Summer. Is the thing that everyone wanted to forget about comes back to destroy you. And this is true even on just a basic psychological level. It's the things that you ignore about yourself, about others, about the world, will eventually come back to destroy you. And so the goal is to just assimilate as much of reality as possible. But this is why I say the Gothic is a genre that's intimately concerned with history. In a country whose literary tradition up to this point is really not concerned with history. Because if we think about this, the Puritans had almost no concern with history outside of biblical history. Everything was typological. Later we moved to the Enlightenment, which is totally internationalist, and its focus is basically on creating something new. Throwing off the chains and shackles of tradition, of the religious structures, of the military, of all these sort of conservative European forces, and building something radically new. Knickerbocker School is, okay, America doesn't have a tradition, so let's manufacture a new tradition out of whole cloth. Then you get transcendentalism, which is, no, back to square one. The Enlightenment's problem was that the Enlightenment was too rationalistic, one, but also, two, that the Enlightenment actually did not go far enough. We need to throw off even more tradition. Throw off even more shackles. No gods, no masters. Go as far as we possibly can and lean into this individualistic project. Well, that's what transcendentalism tries to do. The Gothic is the first American literary genre that says, no, we actually must contend with the past. We must contend with the weight of the past. We must contend with what America has done, which is why it's written primarily by people, I would say, who are extraordinarily discontent with the current American state of affairs, largely on economic grounds. And you look at the life of Poe, Melville, Hawthorne, everyone talks about Hawthorne being a misogynist because he wrote those lines about the scribbling mass of women who are popular. And, nobody's buying enough copies of the Scarlet Letter for him to be able to make a living off of it. Because Hawthorne's great dilemma, it's basically the great dilemma of every artist after the 19th century, which is, when I'm writing books, I'm not making money. When I'm making art, I'm not making money. And when I'm making money, I am not making art. And I and a lot of others can very much relate to that. And so their major problem was they thought this whole Americanism thing was a sham. We thought we were going to have all this freedom, this, that, the other. We are on the brink of civil war. There seems to be no national unity, no real national idea. We are highly nostalgic for the Catholic European past. That shows up a ton in Poe and Hawthorne in particular. Emersonianism is a joke. And on top of all that, where's the money? We have no money. We thought this was going to be a meritocracy where the people who were the best made the most money. Well, Hawthorne says, I'm the best, well, I don't have any money. Melville says the same thing. Melville's a genius. Moby Dick is a work of genius. How is it possible that Moby Dick sells no copies? Moby Dick it sells like 600, 700 copies? His first print is ridiculous. Melville, in his own obituary, they don't write the author of Moby Dick, they write the author of Typee. He is totally forgotten. Moby Dick is totally forgotten until 1950s or so. It's just based this work of absolute brilliance and genius. The market, the ever-efficient market that values goods at their true value, the so-called efficient market hypothesis, does not properly value Moby Dick. So you have a lot of resentment, and that resentment comes out in the form of this social conservatism of what has America repressed? Its link with England, its link with Europe, its link with European political structures, typically feudalism, hierarchical political structures. We're talking about non-democratic structures. I would say the Gothic is a non-democratic genre, interestingly enough, and Catholicism. For better or for worse, this is what we see coming back to haunt people in the American Gothic context. So as a clear example of this, a story we'll look at very soon, I want to do a lecture on this, is Hawthorne's famous short story, My Kinsman Major Molyneux. Now this will spoil it, so skip ahead, but the whole point of My Kinsman Major Molyneux is to say Boston is like hell. I mean, literally, the opening is Dante crossing the river Acheron and ending up on the shores of hell. Instead, we get Robin, who ends up on the shores of Boston at midnight. The only colors you see the entire story are black and red. Everything is black and red, so it looks like hell. It looks like the Inferno. And you have the lynch mob that's set up to tar and feather Major Molyneux being led by Satan himself. And so you go, okay, what could Hawthorne possibly be saying here? Well, Return of the Repressed. We all have this nice sanitized vision of American Revolution. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a right, whatever. George Washington, I cannot tell a lie. All these good, feel-good stories. What about the fact that, and Hawthorne, interestingly enough, Hawthorne mentions Hutchinson right at the beginning of that story. What if the American Revolution was actually violent and barbaric? What if it was actually shameful and disgusting? And Hawthorne entertains that possibility and takes it very seriously. He's like, no, the weight of history will pursue us on this. We shouldn't have done this. And we're trying to repress this and make it seem like this was just fine and dandy. It was not fine and dandy. It was really sickening. And that comes out. And the only way to express that kind of subversive but also highly reactionary and traditionalist thought is by way of the Gothic short story, which is one of the main arguments we're going to contend with over the course of this unit. So the next idea is the sleep of reason produces monsters. And this is not like a literal term per se. Obviously, it's just the title of this famous Goya painting. El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, right? The sleep of reason produces monsters. But the idea here is sound, which is that what happened after the Enlightenment? Reason went too far, pure rationality went too far, and you see the writers of the Knickerbocker School engaging in a playful sort of fantasy, dealing with magical themes, so on and so forth. But then on a metaphysical and even on an epistemological level, Emerson's going to take this further in transcendentalism and say reason is useless. Reason, as we define reason, as rationality, is useless. We should operate based on impulse. We should operate based on emotion. We should operate based on feeling and on the deepest sense of self and on authenticity. And this will lead to the greatest possible consequences. And the writers of the Gothic are incredibly skeptical of this. You can see this in Hawthorne in his famous satire, The Blithedale Romance, which is all about 19th century utopian socialist communities like Fruitlands, where he basically says this idea of just do what you want, follow your impulses, live poetically, it will lead to violence, which of course, without spoiling anything, in the context of the Blithedale romance, it leads to an enormous tragedy at the end of the novel. Precisely because why? When you shut off the rational faculty, you reduce human beings to being less than human beings. This is the idea, again, very socially conservative. There is a concrete sense of human nature in Hawthorne. Like Hawthorne, and I've seen this argument played out even by people who are not religious, who are like, there is no one more Augustinian, like as a follower of the theology of St. Augustine, than Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne himself wasn't Catholic. His daughter Rose Hawthorne actually is beatified. She's on her way to becoming a saint. But Hawthorne himself wasn't Catholic, but that Catholic idea of guilt, original sin, and the need for reason to subordinate the human passions in cooperation with grace, that shows up on every page of Hawthorne. And so one of the central ideas that we see in the Gothic literature is Emerson took this too far. If we don't bring rationality back into human life, the monsters from the id, the monsters from like our unconscious drives are going to come to destroy us. And there's an idea that the American Revolution and the lead up to the Civil War are monsters from the id. They're people's irrational drives taking a hold of them and using pretext to do really sickening things. And what we need to recover is reason. Now, there's also an equal sense in the Gothic that human beings are not primarily rational, that human beings have a lot of unconscious drives. But there is a sense that if anything can save human beings from being the what do you want to say, the vector for these really horrifying, sickening thoughts and ideas, the only thing that's going to save them is reason. And so reason needs to be recovered. Elements of romanticism throughout the Gothic, but there is a sense of, yes, it is wrong. The Enlightenment thinkers were wrong in saying human beings are fully rational, that we operate like robots or computer programs, that God is a fully rational watchmaker. That all wrong, all wrong, all wrong. But Emerson, in going to the opposite extreme of saying just be yourself, just follow your emotions, is going to lead humanity to the precipice. That this Emersonian optimism will not end well, and we need to recover reason or it'll end in tragedy, just as the Blithedale romance ends in tragedy. Good. Next thing you see in the Gothic, both in the British context and the American context, is recovery of medievalism as an aesthetic. So, of course, as I mentioned, Castle of Otranto, The Monk, any of the major Gothic novels you see, Wuthering Heights, they all have elements of medievalism brought into them. It's impossible to talk about the Gothic without there being medieval elements. You see this most particularly, for example, in Edgar Allan Poe. Like numerous stories, like, for example, Masque of the Red Death is a perfect example of this, whereby we are evoking an element of the medieval Catholic worldview. There's a monastery, this, that, the other. And yes, of course, there's a certain decadence in this, that, the other. You could say there's a certain implicit critique. But that atmosphere becomes conducive to horror for the same reasons. The things that we have left behind will come to destroy us. And so America, having fully left behind the world of European tradition, of Catholicism, of feudalism, of monarchy, of hierarchy, those things are going to come back to destroy America or destroy the protagonist of whatever story. And so that's a key element of the Gothic. It's impossible to talk about the Gothic without medievalism. Hopefully I've explained myself here and given you, because what I'm trying to show is basically there's a reason why these things are scary to an English-speaking audience. And there's also a reason why this aesthetic is so popular in America, so popular in Britain, so popular in Germany, and then later so popular in the American South. Like after the Civil War, we get the emergence of Southern Gothic. Well, why? Like you'll see this when we get to, personally, one of my favorite authors of all time, William Faulkner, and then later one of my favorite playwrights of all time is Tennessee Williams. You look at A Streetcar Named Desire, you look at Sound of the Fury, As I Lay Dying, I mean, really pretty much any of Faulkner. What do you see? Southern Gothic as an aesthetic comes in because the weight of the past is there to destroy the South. So the so-called New South of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we're going to forget about the legacy of all these different things, just repress. We're not going to talk about this. We're not going to talk about the way the South was, which in many ways had parallels with feudalism. Feudalism, people don't think about it this way. Feudalism is more or less a benign form of slavery. I mean, it was much better to be a medieval serf than to be a chattel slave in the South. There's no doubt about it. But there are clear parallels between the political structure of the South and the medieval, the medieval political synthesis. There's no doubt about that. And in fact, the Southerners were intimately aware of this. That's why they saw themselves as so chivalric. Manners are so important here. I mean, hell, they literally had, you can go look at this. They had jousts in the South because like all these Protestant Southern landowners were like, yes, this is the Protestant version of feudalism, basically. So there's a lot of links between those two things. And so the New South obviously wants to do away with all that, forget about it, forget about it, forget about it. Well, what ends up happening? The old memories, the weight of the past comes back again to haunt. Haunted plantation. Why is a plantation a fitting site for the Gothic or trauma? Well, one, the aspects of that hierarchical worldview and political synthesis that have been forgotten in favor of a vision that's much more in line with the sort of commercial, mercantile vision of the North, of the Union, of the way the country changes. But also because on a plantation, everyone knows horrific things happen. Slaves were raped, there were abuses of power, slaves were violently abused in many different ways. There were all sorts of secrets and intrigues and things that happened on a plantation for hundreds of years. It's like New York is not a fitting setting for the Gothic. It's like what building in New York is older than 20 years old? It's just, it doesn't make sense. But in the South, you have plantations that are hundreds of years old, that belong to a single family, in these tiny hamlets where there's all these different stories. And so it becomes a fitting setting for the Gothic. And so medievalism, as one of the aspects, at least prior to Southern Gothic, is an intimate part of the Gothic aesthetic. I hope I've made myself clear. If I haven't, please leave comments. I love answering questions, and I love reading your comments, even if it's just to say that you've enjoyed what you're watching. So sentimentalism, I mentioned this before, I'm not going to get too much into this now, but sentimentalism is one of the aesthetic factors that leads to the Gothic. You get the sentimental novels of the 18th century, where you're dealing with women, you're dealing with their emotions, crying, and the struggle for virtue. Okay, so basically you get this interior turn where literature in the medieval period is not really about emotions. Literature in the medieval period is primarily about actions. And you see this most particularly in early medieval texts, like romances. At Cantata mio Cid, Cid's emotions are not important. Cid's actions are important. Beowulf doesn't even have emotions. Beowulf just acts. Beowulf does heroic things. It's impossible to imagine Beowulf being afraid. It's impossible to imagine Beowulf feeling jealousy. It's impossible to imagine Beowulf having any sort of complex human emotions at all. He's like Superman. Superman doesn't have interior conflict, he just does things. Well, Beowulf is very similar, and most medieval texts are not about interior psychological conflict. Not necessarily because they didn't have it, but just it wasn't interesting. And you see this in the classical world too, to the extent that actually some scholars will say there was no concept of interiority in ancient Greece. Because if you look at Homer, anytime someone experiences an intense emotion, they always ascribe it to the gods. There's no sense of just people have complex and turbulent inner emotional worlds. And so in the 18th century, for a variety of different reasons we don't have to get into, in the British context, the focus on the interior emotional world, on the psychosphere, on the world of women, becomes front and center in this new genre, in this new medium that has never been before seen, the novel. We don't have novels in the Middle Ages, we don't have novels in the early modern period. They're an invention of the 18th century. And so that focus on femininity, that focus on the emotional world, on the struggle for virtue, carries into the Gothic. Now, the focus of the emotions of the Gothic are very different. They're focused on the emotion of fear in particular, or melancholy, or a grim, oppressive atmosphere. But there is a continuity between the two. The novel takes the interior turn, is focused primarily on the inner emotional world, usually in a romantic context. The Gothic is going to borrow elements of that, but do it in this defamiliarized context of the world we've forgotten about. In this case, monasteries, castles, so on and so forth. In anti-Catholicism, we talked about this, not always explicit. I think in the British context, more explicit than the American context. I mean, what I mean by this is not like some sort of like religious prejudice or racism against Catholics, although there is some of that. There's definitely some of that. You look at what happens in Charleston, Massachusetts, where they literally, these Protestants are convinced that Catholic priests are essentially abusing these poor nuns that are being held up as sex slaves, and they go burn down a convent. And the nuns are not very happy about it. You can go read about that. But the point is, in the Gothic, we don't see this as like an actual prejudice against Catholics, but what we do see is that traditionally Catholic settings become settings of horror. Even to this day, we have all these horror films about nuns. Why are nuns scary? Like, why are nuns scarier than, let's say, I don't know, a teacher? You could imagine a horror film about a teacher. It's not that scary. Horror film about a nurse, okay, a little bit more, right? Misery, so on and so forth. poor film about a nun, and a nun is terrifying in a way that a teacher or a nurse cannot be. Well, why? Way to the past, return to the repressed. Hopefully this is starting to make some sense for you. Okay, so next part, literary techniques and aesthetic modes. What I mean by that is, what sort of things do we see emerging in the context of the Gothic aesthetic? Well, one is the re-emergence of allegory as a literary genre. You'll see this in Poe, you'll see this in Hawthorne. Like a great example of this in Hawthorne is his wonderful, wonderful satirical allegory. It's an adaptation of Pilgrim's Progress to satirize Emersonianism, the Celestial Railroad. But allegory re-emerges as a genre in the context of the Gothic aesthetic more generally, but in particular in the American context. And you should know what allegory is. Obviously, it's a story where each character or person or setting has a sort of larger symbolic representation that goes beyond just itself. Classic examples be like the morality play Everyman, clear example of an allegory. The Romance of the Rose, another very clear example of the allegory. But this is just part and parcel with the revival of the medieval aesthetic. People are looking back to the past for inspiration throughout this entire period. And so the revival of more medieval genres are brought forth. And so we see a re-emergence and a renewed interest in allegory as a result of just a renewed interest in the Middle Ages more generally. As, hey, at least initially by the early first generation romantics, your Wordsworth, your Coleridge, your Sir Walter Scott, hey, the Middle Ages had positive things. The Middle Ages were not as rationalistic and as uptight and mathematical as we are in the Enlightenment. Let's go back and learn from them. And then later, just as part of this generalized atmosphere of medievalism that the Gothic needs to evoke in order to produce sentiments of horror, we see a renewed interest in allegory. You could say, for example, Mask of the Red Death is an allegory. It's another very clear example of that. Renewal of a medieval genre. Good. Pathetic fallacy as a technique used frequently throughout the Gothic. I mean, what's the most cliche and awful sentence in all of English literature? It was a dark and stormy night. Well, what's going on here is there's a sense that nature corresponds to man's interior feelings. This is a little bit of an extension of Emersonianism, but it's different in the sense that Emerson would say nature is an extension of you and you can control nature. This is nature being out of control because we are out of control. And so, for example, in the most Gothic short story of all time, I joke with my students that it's a bonus round for the Gothic. You could look at The Fall of the House of Usher. It's thunderstorms. Thunderstorms during the climactic event, we see thunderstorms. Well, why? Because it's a reflection of the turbulent, violent interior world of Roderick Usher. That Roderick Usher on the surface looks pale and sickly. Inside, we find out he's doing something really disgusting and degenerate and perverse. And there's a sort of mirror between the objective circumstances in the environment and his interior. And this is part and parcel with the Gothic. You need externalized reflections of dark interior psychic states, which is why things take place in the dark. They take place during thunderstorms. They take place during anything that can provoke this sense of strong emotion related to negative sublime. So we get a sense of the sublime. This is a continuity with generalized romanticism. So where we saw in the Knickerbocker School, not so much in transcendentalism, but where we saw in the Knickerbocker School of like, nature, the overwhelming beauty of nature, a sense of danger, a sense of the grandeur of human life. I can't think rationally because look at how beautiful this landscape is, or look at how beautiful this storm is. Negative sublime is very similar in the sense that the rational mind is overwhelmed and we cannot think, but the rational mind is overwhelmed with horror, usually to the point where something becomes so horrifying that you die. So of course I give this image here from Mask of the Red Death because that's quite literally what happens in the Mask of the Red Death. Later you could look at someone who's very influenced obviously by the Gothic aesthetic, H.P. Lovecraft. Cthulhu evokes negative sublime perhaps better than anything else. It is ineffable. Its presence is so horrifying that if you look at it directly in the eye, you perish. It's so horrifying that it cannot be described in words. And so it's a moment of intense revelation where the thing that is repressed is looked at in the eye. Another clear example of this is in Nathaniel Hawthorne. When you look at My Kinsman Major Molyneux, what happens? In My Kinsman Major Molyneux, when we see Major Molyneux for the first time being paraded, right? They're riding him on a rail. He's tarred and feathered. Yankee Doodle went to town. They're bringing in Major Molyneux in this procession led by Satan. Everyone's shouting, laughing, carnivalesque, which we'll talk about in a moment. This carnivalesque scene, everybody's laughing, shouting, dancing, this, that, the other. Robin sees this, and it's a moment of negative sublime. It's a moment of something so horrifying, his rational faculty cannot process it, and he actually begins to laugh, which is quite interesting, and join in on this laughter. And it's said that his laughter is actually the loudest, which is also quite interesting. But the negative sublime is, I have repressed this thing for so long that now I have to look it in the eye, and when I see the true form of the thing that I did not want to think about, it produces a sensation of horror, because I realize in some sense I deserve it all along. So think about the early modern English Protestant lord who was made a member of the gentry on the basis of confiscated church property. What's going to happen to him? He, at some point, is going to have to face up to the fact that his property came from this sort of immense violation. And imagine if he sees like a decaying corpse of a nun standing at his bedside. That's a moment of negative sublime. It's not that he's realizing the evil nature of the nuns. What he's realizing is the evil nature of his deed, taking control of that property, is now reflected to him, and he can no longer avoid it, and he must be confronted with the weight of history. That's negative sublime. The macabre, obviously an atmosphere of death, of grimness, of the dark elements of human nature. There's a lot of death in Gothic literature. This should be no surprise to anyone. Here we have the dance macabre, the famous one, of skeletons dancing, showing a sort of a disjuncture between, look, we're in the prime of life, we're having fun, this, that, the other, but in actual fact, we're dead. And of course, that disjuncture is part and parcel with the moral element of the Gothic, because if they all looked healthy, you would go, oh, this looks like a fun party. But the whole point is, us having a fun party, us saying carpe diem, live for the moment, don't be concerned about the moral impact of our actions, is the very thing that causes horror, because all of our actions have a moral impact. There's no such thing as a victimless crime. And when we're confronted with the moral impact of live for the moment, live for the present, have fun, drink, eat, be merry, we're confronted with horror. We're confronted with the return of the repressed. The very thing that we didn't want to think about now looks us in the eye, which is always what we see in horror as a genre. I mean, otherwise, it would be like in Scream, the characters who were, prudish, didn't do drugs, didn't drink, so on and so forth. Those characters would die first, and that would produce some sort of horrifying sensation. But it doesn't. It only produces a horrifying sensation because we, on some level, realize that any location or any setting where everything's about live for the day, live for the present, have fun, eat, drink, be merry, produces a sense of repulsion and horror, because we know that's not what human beings are made for. That's why carnivals are scary. Like amusement parks and carnivals and clowns are scary, because we realize human beings are not made to be amused. Human beings are not made to be entertained. Those things are scary for a reason. They come back and present us in our faces with the horror of what it is to be a hedonist and live for pleasure. You even see this in non-Gothic novels. Like, for example, The Great Gatsby. Without getting too much into the plot of The Great Gatsby, because obviously we'll do a unit on that, the thesis of The Great Gatsby is there's no such thing as a victimless crime. Those who live for pleasure and live for the moment eventually are going to end in bloodshed and violence. The pursuit of pleasure will always end in bloodshed and violence. We see that in Gatsby, and we see that in the Gothic. And the macabre aesthetic definitely evokes that, as do the elements of carnivalesque. So carnivalesque as a literary trope is a very broad topic. Bakhtin obviously wrote a very famous essay on this that we could talk about at length in a course on literary theory. But for the purposes of understanding the Gothic, it's just worth knowing that this is the sense of upheaval, in the sense of inversion. So a classic example of something carnivalesque is before Carnival, during Carnival. Carnival is the lead up to Lent. So Lent is 43 days of abstinence, whereby you're not eating meat, you are engaging in the fast of the church, which used to be very strict in the Catholic world, now is not so strict. In the Orthodox world, it is still very strict. And so the idea is we're going to have a period leading up to this intense fast where we consume all of the meat that we're not going to be able to consume for the next 43 days. We have a large amount of sexual relations, in part because traditionally during Lent, there were no sexual relations. And we're just going to engage in this fun festival. And so in some towns, some of the festivals that emerged during Lent were things like, hey, let's take the town fool, the drunk, the person that's just like an absolute loser in every way. And let's make him king for a day. And he can do whatever he wants. He can tell everyone to do what he wants. The wives will tell the husbands what to do. The husbands will have to cook dinner. We'll take all the important people in the town, like the priest, the Lord, so on and so forth, and we'll make them have to ride an ass and be fools. And so we will have this moment of intense inversion as a sort of social relief mechanism, where just for one day the inmates can run the asylum and everybody feels better afterwards, and we all have a lot of fun. That's carnivalesque at its essence, and it evokes elements of festivity, the body, gluttony, excess, so on and so forth. But the carnivalesque, as it shows up in the Gothic, is a scene of horror, precisely for the same reason, that this world of hedonism, this world of revelry, deals, or rather gets uncomfortably close to unconscious drives that, if they were unleashed, would be absolutely terrifying. Which, again, we see, for example, in My Kinsman Major Molyneux, is that parade where the inmates are running the asylum, instead of the British colonial authority having authority, it's all these random nobodies in Boston who get together, including like really shady people, like prostitutes, pirates, this, that, the other. All these shady people decide, no, we're going to run the asylum today, and they go in essentially lynch mob Major Molyneux. Well, everybody's having fun and laughing, so why is it so disturbing? Well, it's disturbing precisely because we realize the inmates shouldn't be running the asylum. There's something weird going on here. And on top of that, all this fun and festivity is touching uncomfortably close to human drives that are really, really scary. Because the drives for unbridled pleasure and hedonism are very, very close and not that distinct from the drives to murder, rape, steal, so on and so forth. And on top of that, they treat human beings like they're animals, as if there's nothing better to do than just eat, drink, be merry, and live like a pig. And we know deep down that that's not correct. And so the carnivalesque, when presented properly, is something that produces horror. You see that, for example, in Pinocchio, right? The classic example is the carnival is something quite scary, is something that is not dignified for human beings to participate in. So that's the carnivalesque aesthetic. We also see melancholia. So melancholia, just the aesthetic that deals with melancholy. This is grimness, darkness, isolation, reflection, depression, those types of sort of deep, reflective, pensive circumstances show up over and over and over again. So there are elements of Ahab's character that reflect melancholia. There are, for example, in Fall of the House of Usher, Roderick Usher's character is profoundly afflicted by a sense of melancholia. And so melancholy as an emotion and the environment of melancholy is very important to the Gothic. It's also part of the revival of the medieval aesthetic, this idea of humoralism, the revival of humors as an understanding of human beings, very, very opposed to the modern scientific understanding of how human personality operates. Abjection is another clear concept of a cast-off humanity. So abject, like eject, to throw away. Characters who completely and utterly lose their humanity and become debased, become demonic, become subhuman. Ahab is a clear example of this. Ahab, when he throws away the pipe in Moby Dick, becomes an abjected human being. Ahab, from that point, is no longer human. He is, in some sense, demonic. Because the last creature comfort he has, the last human pleasure that Ahab has, is the pipe. The pipe is the only thing that consoles him. Human beings smoke tobacco. Demons don't smoke tobacco. Angels don't smoke tobacco. Animals don't smoke tobacco. That is a very human, bodily creature comfort. To enjoy alcohol, to enjoy sexual intercourse, to enjoy a good meal. These are human corporeal pleasures. And Ahab rejects them, but rejects them in a sort of inverse consecration. Instead of rejecting worldly pleasures to pursue God, he rejects worldly pleasures to devote himself to the purpose of evil, which in this case is killing Moby Dick. Revenge on a dumb brute, that's blasphemy. That's what Starbuck says. And Starbuck, very much a man of the world. Starbuck, very much a sort of worldly, bodily, excessive figure who is not objected, who is in some sense fully human. Ahab rejects his humanity. And we see numerous characters enter into this state of objection throughout Gothic literature. And the last but not least, I can't even look at this one, it makes me so uncomfortable. The sense of the uncanny. They're not twins, by the way. Everybody says they're twins from The Shining. They're not twins. They're sisters 9 and 11, I think is how old they are. They're obviously killed in the Overlook Hotel. I'm going to switch because it's freaking me out. The uncanny is very, what do you want to say this? It's a term that's developed by Sigmund Freud to talk about an experience that we have where we see something familiar in a defamiliarized context and it produces a sensation of uncomfortableness and horror. Now, evolutionary psychologists are going to say this has to do with like, if you see your mom, but she's very pale and she's lost a lot of weight, that produces a sensation of the uncanny because she might be sick and you don't want to get a disease. That could be the case, but really it's just something is almost there, but it's not quite there, and that makes you uncomfortable. That's a sort of general psychological state that we see. And so there are numerous instances of the uncanny avant la lettre, like very much prior to Freud, that we're going to see in all the Gothic literature throughout this unit. And like a classic example of this is if you go watch one of my favorite horror movies of all time, 100% dealing with this idea of Return of the Repressed. This would be Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. When Mia Farrow loses all of that weight and becomes very pale and her skin is almost blue looking, it produces a sensation of the uncanny because you saw Mia Farrow at the beginning of the movie looking healthy, looking beautiful, looking cute, and then she slowly, almost imperceptibly starts to lose her health and provoke a sensation of uncanny of like it's Mia Farrow, but it's not Mia Farrow. Similar here, like they're different. They're definitely two different people. They look very similar. They're wearing the same outfit, but there's something different about them, and it makes you uncomfortable. We'll see numerous instances of the uncanny throughout the literature we're going to look at in this unit. I hope you found this covering of the unit vocabulary helpful in some way. It goes over a lot of the big ideas we're going to talk about. And some of the things we already discussed when we looked at the Gothic note sheet. This will be a guide for you to be thinking about as we enter into some of these short stories, poems, so on and so forth through this unit, which is a good one. It always is one of my students' favorite units. And we are done with transcendentalism. We are now back into the realm of literature as most people think of literature, which I'm sure you're very happy about. As always, if you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments. I read all the comments. I love receiving comments. And as always, I would be remiss if I didn't mention I have some interesting programs. If you liked what you heard in this lecture and you're interested in more stuff that I'm putting out, one thing I have is a program called the College Degree Accelerator. It's designed to help you graduate college in 2 years. It's everything you would need to do so between video lectures, study guides for AP exams. It has a full ebook and outline showing you, hey, based on whether you're a junior, based on whether you're a senior, based on whether you're a freshman in college, based on whether you're a freshman in high school, here's what you can do to graduate college as quickly as possible and do what I did, which is graduate at the age of 19. You can find all of that in the College Accelerator degree program. Go take a look at that down below in the description. Let me know what you think, and if you have questions about that, put them below as well. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care.